Okay, I don't know how long this is going to take, so I'm going to start on time. So thank you for making it to the last day of the conference. I put this in, and I wasn't sure it was going to actually take. I would like to be deliberately provocative in this particular talk. I'm not trying to demean or deride any of our practices or where we're going with that. But I do think that they need to be examined, that we need to examine the edges of our practice and consider the implications from those pieces. I'm a strategist, an evaluator. I should put my name up. I'm Kate. I'm a strategist and an evaluator, and I work with museums to help clearly articulate their programs, what their outcomes are, what sort of theories of action they're using, and I want to surface and describe and examine those assumptions about how our program did, how it will work, what it will achieve. And this is a logic model, an internal working logic model, so pretend you didn't see it, of a particular piece that we were working on recently. And I don't expect you to read all of this, but I am thinking about the process of this articulated our assumptions about what this website was going to do, right? Because and not just writing it, but talking through it, saying things like, well, if they actually use it, well, okay, so then let's just unpack that one first statement in terms of what it means to use and who they are and all of those different pieces. This is critical thinking, right? This is a process of critical thinking that we're taking ourselves through in order to generate something like this. We often talk about it in the programs that I hear designed. We don't model it as well as we should be modeling critical thinking. We don't put enough intentionality into our programs as we're designing them, into our exhibitions as we're designing them, all of those pieces. When you take something that's complex like this, that has many intersecting variables, we reduce it down to something that's very linear and that is very driven towards one particular end, right? And that this is the generalized theory of action or generalized logic model for a particular change. In thinking about how we've done this as a community, I've been thinking about Ignite. And so for me, Ignite serves as a way to demonstrate how we as a community think about and express the values that we have, right? It serves as guideposts for newcomers, and we explicate and codify these values that we talk about during that and during the rest of the conference as well, but it's almost a statement of creed in between individual talks that we stitch together. I've noticed over the last few years, through Ignite and through other places within the MCN community, the discussion of a couple of different values, two of which I'd like to talk about today. So the first value that I have, I haven't renewed my carbonite either. The first value that I'd like to talk about is improving through visitor input. So as some of you have heard me say, as a longtime member of this community, what the visitor thinks or feels or how they react to the programs was not something that we used to talk about. And we've made enormous progress in incorporating people's motivations, people's needs, people's concerns in the products and programs and exhibitions that we design. And we talk about this in all sorts of ways that we didn't before. This is an incredibly valuable movement within our field, and people often articulate this with this interaction with the visitor. And the second piece that I've noticed us articulating is that museums are not neutral. And I'd like to talk about both of these pieces because I think that they intersect and in fact conflict in a variety of different ways that I don't hear articulated as often. So let's talk through some definitions about what that means. A lot of this improving visitor input is done through a variety of strategies that we use now, loosely grouped under design thinking, in human-centered design, in service design, in these topics of iteration, right? And they have values within these pieces. So thinking that through, if we're going to talk about service design, this is a concept about looking at the whole journey. about looking about not just the key experiences, but all of those moments along the way, that we can put together a service to improve that interaction between the visitor and the institution, right? And so there's a lot of journey mapping that's happening coming out of service design. There's a lot of really interesting work there where we're looking at it from a more holistic perspective on one person's journey through our experiences. That's particularly useful and can help us see that it is not within, it is set within a context, right? It's set within a context of the bathrooms, of what we had to eat, about how we get to the institution, all of those pieces. The other piece that's coming through design thinking is often human-centered design, right? And that this is really about prioritizing that sort of visitor input that we were talking about before in terms of quite frequently designing around a problem, right? That you frame your problem, you have to identify it, frame that problem, and then go and get some input there to really deepen and enrich the problem and think through that so that you can make adequate design decisions and how you are going to work around that solution. You may try multiple solutions with audiences in order to get them to a place where you have that working in the way that you intended. You have the outcomes that you are hoping for. Within this, it often leads to lots of prototyping, rapid design sprints. There is this concentration on user research and this incredible premium on empathy, right? So 15 years ago, I don't think I heard empathy mentioned at a conference that year, right? At all. Anyway, but this is something that we talk about all the time that is in danger of becoming glib, that is in danger of becoming a buzzword that means all sorts of things and nothing at all. So let's talk specifically about empathy within this. And, if you're going to talk about the generic definition of empathy, it's this capacity to understand or feel what another person is experiencing, right? It's different from sympathy, but sympathy doesn't sound as good in our vernacular. Empathy is really about experiencing it from their frame of reference, and it's important in design criteria to be able to do so that you can make those right choices, that you can make those tools easy to handle, that you can make your navigation intuitive, all of those pieces from the frame of reference. But there's a dangerous piece here, right, too. I believe that we can and should have empathy for individuals. Absolutely. And I don't want you to think I'm questioning that. But empathy for me is about individuals. It's not about classes of people. It's certainly not about empathy for your user. What is the user? What have we reduced this person to a class of people? If I say that I have empathy for Native Americans, what does that mean? What does that sound like? Can I presume that I understand and feel that frame of reference? I think it's incredibly presumptive to say that, to even come to the point that I have empathy for this type of piece, because that's not what that is for. I find it to be patronizing, and I find it to be a way of maintaining cultural dominance through empathy within these pieces. That this is a system, that this human-centered design comes out of a system that is built for-profit, primarily technological solutions that have spread, where we go and we have decided that we can make a better product by co-opting someone's needs and emotions and bringing them back to a predefined solution, which we have chosen, and then have people pay for. That is where this is originally thing. And we can argue about how that has spread through human-computer interaction and pieces. But this is a model specifically that is about, I am not my user. And I need to go and understand those pieces. It is fundamentally a reductionist othering to put these people in classes of users and say, I have to have empathy because I am not that person, right? And I am the museum. And I will have empathy for those people that I am trying to serve. The individuals, the evaluators of color that I speak to about this, do not necessarily believe in empathy. We replace that word and we see how it sounds. I have kindness towards Native Americans. I have compassion towards Native Americans. I have pity towards Native Americans. What does that mean? Am I feeling better by saying that within my design process? I don't think so. I don't want to hear about the empathy. I don't think it moves us forward. I think it perpetuates the cultural dominance. I would like to have empathy for individuals. I don't want to have empathy for classes of people. Right? I don't think that's a productive conversation. And we are not absolved of our responsibility for putting out better products and designs, for putting out exhibitions, for working in our world to say that we did some human design and we followed this framework and therefore we've improved something by going and talking to someone. That's not enough. It's a start, but it is certainly not enough. So then what is enough, right? So where does that change lead us if we're supposed to think a little more critically about these pieces? And that's where we need to talk about a different level. That's where I would like to go in a different level. So when we talk about journey mapping, we're improving the experience for an individual, a set of individuals. We're looking at that as you move through our institutions and you interact with them and you develop loyalty or you don't. Or at least we hope. So I'll put in a plug here that we spend a lot of time on talking to our users about design, and we spend very little time talking about the impact on their lives. And you all tell me over and over again, there's not enough money to go and look at and examine critically what we've done to see if it works. So we hope there's change at the individual level, but a lot of times we don't really know. So change at the individual level. Okay, that's good. These tools that we've used, this human-centered design, maybe we've made it a little bit better. Maybe this map has gotten our person to the next place. But what about collective impact, right? Are we hoping for individual change as these pieces go through? I mean, is that, we've moved the needle in these pieces. It's good, right? But I think that conflicts with what we're talking about directly in terms of museums are not neutral. Right? That change on an incremental, individual piece where we're working people in through design is disconnected from this concept of neutrality and how we are trying to decolonize our institutions. So let's go back to what I do, right? And we'll talk about this generalized model. And as I've been working, there's a number of different projects that I've been working on recently that have more than one programmatic element, that have more than one piece, right? They're a combined set of things that we're trying to work together towards a particular end. But this is a model which I use every day, and it is so linear, right? Even when we talk and draw these arrows back that come back to these things, it is so linear. And so, as an example, the project, I showed the logic model for a project I'm working on earlier, which is the Chronicle of African Americans in Horse History. And we have been working with users. I've been doing a lot of individual interviews, group discussions with the African American community of Lexington, Kentucky, the East End. Right? And we're talking about what these folks need to feel part of the community and what their user requirements are, and we're going through and thinking about design issues for them, what are their motivations, so that we can inform the designers for this website to go further. Right? And then we work that through their individual pieces, and we come back. And what we've done is what they've asked. We've dramatically increased the proportion of resources for these individuals, right? And so we have so much more on Black Horsemen, and there's so much more to say in this story. And then we take it to the teachers. And they tell us what we've done has re-traumatized their students. Because the proportionality of that misses the context of those photographs and documents within it, and it represents a narrative that they have been trying to flip and what we have doubled down on within this. We've gone through the model, right? And we have not, and we've come to the outcome, and we planned and we talked about our assumptions, but we have had downstream effects that were unintended. Because despite all of our critical thinking, it is in isolation. And each of those users was true and authentic, and we had in-depth conversations, and we were working towards hearing them, and they felt heard. When we put our product in front of them, they got what they needed. But they weren't trying, we weren't asking them to change the narrative. We were asking them what they needed. And we satisfied that. But did we cause harm elsewhere? Right? And so that even going through that process is not examining critically enough what that piece was. It's nowhere near sufficient. And to pat ourselves on the back for reducing this complexity of users to where the actions that we have do not have impact elsewhere is perpetuating the system. It's dangerous. It's not just an insufficient response, it's a dangerous response, right? To have had spent all this time and money to double down on something that traumatizes someone. So, what can we do, right? So I've been talking about this with a few of you over the last 6 months or so as I think about where the trends in testing get us now and where we still yet have to go. And several of you have told me that, okay, you've been identifying the problem, Kate, but what's the solution? And I don't know that I have that solution. That's part of the reason I'm bringing it to this community. But I've had some ideas in other projects that I've been playing with, and I'd like to share a couple of those with you. So one is a process of systems thinking, right? And I was in a course on systems thinking with some other individuals, and I will show you some of our coursework here. And we also went on to then use it in a number of projects. I'm using it in a Pan-Smithsonian project on changing the narrative of American women in history. So the goal is to change how women are represented in history in our country. So, you know, one of those outcomes that you need to spend some time unpacking to look at the causes and the symptoms, but also works very well in terms of thinking about it as systemic change, right? I'd like to be here for systemic change. So I'm going to give credit where credit is due. This was my 3 team members plus myself, in case you recognize me. And this is work based on the work that the 4 of us did together over a period of 4 or 5 months or so. And then we've come to this. And so we had a challenge. We were working specifically with the Museums Are Not Neutral challenge, right? And so we went through a series of exercises, and you can't read that, but I would be happy to pass it out. It's more of an example than to dig into these pieces. But it was talking about the lack of inclusive infrastructure and the causes and effects of that within our community. And the end run of that is that you develop a systems map. And so this is our systems map on a large scale. And what it is that we are trying to explore not what we're trying to do, but the causes and effects of things and how they relate to one another in this system that perpetuates the inequity. It's not just lack of diversity in boards, and it's not just lack of the right collections, but these things have intersections and they have cause and effect within one another, right? So we need to be able to map that in our head to talk about where our projects are trying to influence things so that we can look and see where in the cycle we can be most effective. So you might be able to read some of that. This is a detail of the map, and we spent months working this through, right? And we still have many steps to go. This is not funded work, but in thinking through and verifying this through the lived experience of a wide variety of people. But that's where we got to, right? And then in the deeper version, which I won't show you, there are pieces about pluses and minuses and neutral pieces so that this might have a negative effect on one thing but a positive effect on something else, or a neutral effect on something else, right? So that we're looking at the interrelationships for this, and then we can plot them on the map. For the history initiative that we're working on, it's a huge piece. It's a huge map, and we're in the process at the moment of getting feedback on that. Because then we can demonstrate to our funders, to the staff, that your program is sitting over here, and we're hoping when we talk about an outcome, it's related to this issue. But there are all these other issues within the constellation around it, right, that may or may not have interaction effects with what you're trying to do. The second piece that I'd like to talk about is co-creation. So I've been working on, many of you know, in citizen science pieces for a long time. And so at the conference that I was at, Scott might know, it was the year after whatever that other conference was, like 10 years ago, right? We started to recognize that not all citizen science projects are the same, right? Some have very educational goals. People are going to learn how to plant milkweed. And some of them have very scientific goals, where we're going to generate enough data to be able to show how bird migration has changed across the US and where the conservation lands within. And there's lots of different types of activities within there. And there was a tension in the community that one type of citizen science would be better than another, right? And that there was a value judgment, and we were pitting science and scientific research against education, and we did not know how to resolve that. And we ended up coming up with this model, and this model is still in use today within the public participation in scientific research community, and you will hear them use this sort of language from a contributory, a collaborative, and a co-created project. And this was the first time that I had really worked 10 years or so ago in a co-created project setting. And the interesting thing about this is all of these pieces are valuable, right? The water quality people, oh my God, they are so dedicated and so important. And when I talk to them, they collect samples and sometimes analyze it. That's all they do. And they are very proud of their work within that. That's valuable and needed. So this is not intended to be a value judgment, but it is a very different looking project when it's co-created. When it's co-created, the individuals who you're working with are defining the question, are defining the problem, and coming up with a solution, right? And so the tension there, I see projects now being talked about as co-created projects that are really, we did a lot of focus groups here, we've had some advisory board meetings there, we have people coming in. But the defining features of a co-created project is that those people are involved in the problem definition, in your idea state, in that iteration in human-centered design before you're putting something out on the floor, because they are defining the problem. It's not a product that you want to put out. It's not an exhibition within these pieces. And there are constraints around that. But it is fundamentally within that space. The Wing Luke Museum is in Seattle. If you all haven't been, is an example of this, of an institution that's been working towards co-created projects for many years. And the community at the Wing Luke, their job is to work on exhibitions that the community comes up with, curates, and puts on the floor, right? And so they are facilitators for this exhibition process that is defined by the community, organized by the community, and put on by the community. It is an entirely different model of museum making, and I don't suggest that we all need to be there. But I do suggest that this points to where we are doing things and where we're not doing things. It talks about power dynamics. It talks about time. A lot of the human-centered design pieces, we're trying to do rapid iteration to get to a minimally viable product, right? That's not the same thing as an intensive co-created process with our audience. That's skating by with some amount of feedback in order to get to an MVP. That is fundamentally different than changing the narrative, because it takes time to change the narrative. So the two concepts I would say on co-created is that the audience, the community, and even that is othering, right? We'll recognize that. Has to be in defining the need. And if they are not in there in defining the need, then it isn't co-created. And they have to be involved in deciding the solution. And to do that, you have to share authority. And I've been on co-created projects that are all fine and good up until that point. They're all for transparency, they're all for trust, but you're not going to come into my museum and actually get a vote in the decision-making process. I'd like to then think about these different pieces not as solutions, but as starting conversations within that critical thinking piece, because we're pretty self-congratulatory about involving the audience. We are. And we have so far to go. This is not sufficient. We're in the middle of a mass extinction event. We are in the middle of a wounded set of communities and a society that is degrading. And we must change our practice. We cannot get complacent about this. We can't fall victim to this sort of tragedy of the commons where we've looked at people's individual needs and caused that enough to have systemic solutions to the problems that we are wrestling with. We certainly shouldn't be thinking about improving through products that were built on a capitalist mindset in order to have people buy things and appropriate those needs while ignoring the downstream effects. That these things are not done in isolation. And I struggle with the fact that we would uncritically adopt tools that are not designed to promote inclusivity as a means for improving our institutions. To the floor. Anyone? Scott.
I mean, it's just super simple response, but I feel like so much of this is inherent in just the use of technology. And when I think about, two humans standing together, solving a problem, looking at something, describing what each other sees, the computer can't do that. And that's when you boil a lot of this down, it comes down to what we lose in using technology as a connection between each other. That's
It's an issue of humanity and complexity.
Yeah.
Right.
Unless there's so many.
Is there anyone else? Yeah.
And okay. But I think it's not just that it's incompatible with technical development. Speaking as somebody who is currently in the middle of being on the receiving end of a quote-unquote co-creation project, which is they're trying to close a whole bunch of schools in my city, and the school district keeps coming to us and saying, well, we want to co-create with you, when what's clear is what we want is you to help us get to the outcome that we've already decided upon. And so, so I mean, this is a problem across all kinds of initiatives. I mean, this is a citywide social one. But yeah, we're there too.
It takes a huge amount of time in co-creation. It's not for the faint of heart, and I'm not recommending this for every project, right? I think that that's disingenuous, right, in terms of what we're trying to do. On the other hand, I would like a critical piece on it's okay to describe your project accurately, right? We're not in a co-created project. We're in a collaboration. We're going to talk honestly and transparently about what that means and the limitations and biases there. So, do you have any other voices that got Larry and Matt? Who else? Anyone have a question or a comment wants to raise their hand now?
Well, I have another question, which is, I mean, my sense is that, sorry, my sense is that there's so many untold stories of failed co-creation.
Yes.
I mean, I've experienced a lot of them, and many of them I don't even share, and I'm guessing that a lot of people are in the same place because you often hit a brick wall someplace, and you damage the relationship even more when you can't actually follow through.
It was a breakthrough for me when working with some of the other folks on my current staff, when we were able to define that essentially everything we do in our work comes down to trust. Trust between us, trust between us and the people we're working with. And in that, if we violate that trust, then the project is imperiled, right? And that having that as a core value, and then from there, transparency, and those sorts of pieces that we had to spiral outward from there.
only in an environment of trust can you say uncomfortable things, so you really do need it. I'm a big fan of human-centered design, but what I am not a fan of is it being used as a silver bullet for everything, and I think that's what you are talking about here. And I think that what I've always felt its biggest blind spot was the systems part of it. It got sometimes really good, allowed you to get to really good insights about how an individual was facing barriers to certain kind of behavior, but it didn't tell you what happened when they went outside in the world. And so I like all three methodologies you presented here kind of in concert, if you have the ability to do that: human-centered design, community-based research, systems level thinking. When you use them all together, they work pretty darn well. So thanks.
So we did the co-creative project that, yes, but yes, it's not easy, right? We weren't asking it for easy.
First of all, Kate, just thank you for that. I could very much feel that these are things you are thinking through and grappling with, and that was very apparent. But while you're talking, I was getting quite emotional, and I think that one of the things, or there's two things I've been thinking about a lot, and one is how we recognize different kinds of knowledge as equally important, and that includes experience-based knowledge and expertise, as well as emotional knowledge, and having all of these values, because it's very different from how museums are expected to run. And the other thing I was just thinking about, I think one of the things that's sort of interesting is how we resource for and plan for relationships, not transactions. So thinking that, I was really struck, you mentioned, like with the Wing Luke example, you were talking about the work is labour intensive, the work requires flexibility. It also requires, if we're talking about trust specifically, time and ongoing resources and being where people are rather than the other way, like rather than expecting people to come to us. And that's not, like, because so much work is project-based, that becomes a very different thing. And so how we resource for longer-term relationship development, it also feels like that might be part of what is part of this. But I have no answers. There were two things that I responded to.
It's not efficient, right?
Yeah.
You can't be efficient and do that work in the same way. You have to have some sort of planned efficiency within that, because that's what the relationships mean. Okay, I got one question left, and we can.
Thanks. Amazing stuff. I guess I want to just, being that I'm very interested, I'm Matt, board member and from the Museum of Natural History. But like, so as a Museum of Natural History, right, we can't, and maybe this, I'm picking up an inference that isn't there, but we have to relax our intended outcomes, which in our case is saving the planet and informed voters. We can't do that, but trying to get, even as sort of a board member or whatever, trying to get 600 voices, and I'm not talking about across the complexity of peoples that exist in the world, but like, there are people who aren't going to be in the room. And so as soon as you create a situation of co-creation, you get people with time on their hands to help.
Right.
And so like, it's infinitely complicated. And so I just wonder if in your thinking, if there's something to do, like, where do we stand as those who have been tasked or who have opted into this role of like, I will take this on as my life's work to try to affect these changes. Then I want it to be impactful. I don't actually, like, I want to involve everybody, but not the people who deny climate change. I don't want them to have a say in what goes on the wall, you know?
That's a whole different presentation, but I mean, I do think that I have found thinking through the constructs of my assumptions in a multidimensional format rather than a linear theory of change logic model format has added the needed complexity I've needed to be able to talk to people at different points in time. That's the short answer before Dustin gets angry. This is from the quotes at the beginning when you came in, was about how we can do excellent research and still have, and data itself is not neutral. Museums are not neutral, but data is not neutral.